Okay.
Hello, welcome back to Human Conversations. I'm here, Chelsea, and we have
Melanie.
Melanie, my co-host. Today we have a pretty big topic. We're going to be talking about
Yeah, I'm
some big.
excited about this topic.
Me too. I think actually I feel kind of excited and a bit like hesitant just because of there's been a few different things that have been passed or repealed. So um, we wanted to talk today about the recent Title VII of the Civil Rights Act that was passed for permitting non-discrimination against the LGBTQ community, including gender identity, trans people. So I'm actually just going to kind of get started here. I'm going to talk about the act that kind of break it down a little bit of the behind the scenes. I did want to start and just say that I got all my information from the New York Times, but more specifically from Michael Barbaro, and then just did some digging and listened to a podcast and of an interview that was recently taken, actually today. So this information is coming to you from a reliable source. I just wanted to say that just to start. So actually, should I just get into it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know if a lot of people were aware of this. I mean, I didn't know the specifics of this, but there were 27 states that did not allow same-sex marriage or same-sex marriage, people who would identify as being in the LGBTQ or LGBTQIA community, and like if they were working with their company or working with their business. Let's say someone, a gay man went to marry his partner, and he decided, okay, I'm gonna get married this weekend. There were 27 states that when he came back from the weekend and went into work, he could actually be fired for, just what he did on the weekend. So unfortunately, that's more than half of our nation, right? So
Right. Yeah.
that's a pretty big deal. And this act did not protect people like in any capacity, because this could happen at any time. So what I thought was interesting when I was doing some research here, there were 3 separate cases that actually brought this whole issue forward. And there were 2 gay men. One was a government worker in Georgia, and the other one was a skydiver instructor. And then the last was a trans person named Amy Steffens, who worked in a funeral home. And so these were the 3 cases that brought the question of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is a landmark piece of the civil rights legislation, which this prohibits discrimination of diversity. So all of gender, sex, all of that stuff. So what it came down to was a lot of times when things come into question, they are literally dissecting what the words of the law are. So whether this word is in the sentence, whether a period is in the sentence, like how it's read, everything. So that's what it comes down to. So we all know that after Trump was elected, he appointed some justices to the Supreme Court. And so what was quite interesting about this whole event was that there were 5 very conservative justices, one of which was appointed by Trump. And basically what happened was people were speculating that there was going to be a 5-4 with the liberal vote, because they know liberals are going to vote for this pass of the act. So they were, people were really nervous, and they already made their assumptions that there's no way that these conservative justices are going to want to participate in this, movement. And somehow not somehow, but they were able to sway two conservatives. And actually, one of those conservative justices was appointed by Trump, so it was Gorsuch. And the other one was John G. Roberts. And they believe that basically the example that they gave was that if you're working for a company and you have two employees that on paper and in person, they're completely the same. And the only difference is whom they, their gender. So if one is a woman or one is a male, you can't discriminate based on their sex, as they read the law, because it included the word discrimination because of sex. And so not discrimination against a person. So that's what they decided. That's why they went for it, because they read it as discrimination because of sex, not just discrimination against a person. And so these justices, they believe that the way it was read and the way that it was supposed to be read was in favor of the Civil Rights Act, and that's why it was eventually passed. What I found even more interesting was the two people who opposed. So it was a 6-3 victory. But the two justices that were like really against this act, they actually, the reasoning they gave was because they found that the way it was written was not a natural way of reading it. So that's why I pointed out that when the laws are getting, into question, it literally comes down to how is it read? Like, how are you reading this law? Which I just think is like, holy cow, like, really? I was like, that could change anything,
Right. I mean, so many people read something and it could be perceived in so many different ways.
Exactly. So that's kind of the background on what happened. And so what's coming up now is, people have been saying, well, this is going to change so much. And how is religion going to impact the professional setting? Does religion have protection rights or laws, or, so there was discussion around that as well. If people don't agree with certain things, then are they going to be protected? And ultimately, though, I'm very stoked about what happened, because like I don't even think I have to explain why, but I do still think there's a lot more that needs to kind of be worked on. What do you think? What are your thoughts about that?
So, I mean, I do think it's a great move. Definitely historic in that, making it basically illegal to discriminate against LGBT population in the workforce. In one of the articles that I read, it said that there's about 7 million LGBT workers in the workforce, and then they estimate 1 million trans individuals in the workforce. So I just want to point out that number is probably underrepresented, or will hopefully go up now because of this passing. So that's kind of the significance of it, really, is it making it, the workforce a safer place for LGBT identified, but specifically trans individuals who, according to research, definitely get more discrimination in the workforce because of their more sometimes obvious state of transitioning, if they're in the middle of their transitioning process. And I'll get a little more into that, but generally they do have a harder time with finding employment and sustaining employment. So hopefully now that this this law has, this act is passed, then hopefully that number will go up and more trans individuals will be able to get into the workforce, because many of my clients that I've worked with who are trans definitely have wanted to find employment and have struggled to find employment where they were treated fairly. And so many of them have had to rely on like government aid and things like that. So actually, this will help a lot of people get off of government aid and actually, make a big improvement in the economy, to be honest, if this really goes, if we really think about how much of an impact this can have on the future of our society. It's really a positive step forward.
Right. And I think that's why it's so important to point out, like, even the smallest thing is deciphering what a word means, because what was interesting is that this law was actually created by someone who was like so much in the past that he already retired, right? And he was a conservative justice as well. And so they even thought the fact that he even included the word sex in the law was like kind of like, what, how did he, that's kind of interesting. Like they never would have thought he would do that. And so now it was up for interpretation, and they decided, well, you can't discriminate against, just because if you're going to tell a woman, oh, you're fired because you married this woman, but then you have a male employee who also is married to a woman, how is that going to make sense? That's discrimination. So I really hope that, I know there's going to be an adjustment, just like any transition, there's going to be an adjustment
Right.
period that's going to be soft and ooey gooey and
It's
touch
gonna
and
take
go.
some time. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
gonna take some time for, like, I mean, this act is great, but I think it'll still be a while before people in the trans community really feel safe, like seeking employment in the same way that maybe cisgender people seek employment.
Right. And I actually think this is a good place to bring up, because I know you're going to go into sort of just making it more clear what gender identity means and all those things. But I think the reason why Melanie and why you and I are kind of hesitant is like, well, there was also in the same breath another CARE Act that kind of was repealed for trans lives. And so that's why it's hard, because it's like we have so much going on over here, and then in the same breath we also have our president doing something else. So anyways, I just thought that was important to also talk about.
I think that's
Yeah.
very in line with history, though. Sometimes there's movement in one area in one time, and there's backsteps in others. But hopefully, as a whole society, we are always like moving forward towards more equality and justice.
Yeah.
But part of that then goes into the next thing, which is about knowledge. So I think that's the biggest barrier for many people is just like being uneducated on things. And I mean, not on purpose, a lot of times, just there's just a lack of information being provided, and that causes people to be fearful and then make assumptions about things without properly being educated on them. So for example, what it is to be transgender. Let's just talk about gender identity, for a minute. So
lay it out on us, educate us.
Gender identity, okay, very distinct from sexual orientation, which I just want to first point that out. Your gender identity is how you identify as a person with regards to your gender. So do you identify with more masculine, feminine, or in between, or not, none of them? And you can be in all of those categories. Like, there's not, people like to characterize gender as binary, two things, just male or female, but that's not necessarily true. We've learned that gender is on a spectrum. It's a continuum, and when you imagine the spectrum, it's not like a straight line from male to female, it's more like a circle, and we fall somewhere on that circle of masculinity, femininity, and kind of all of those traits that go into those things. Does that kind of make sense to you, Chelsea? Like, you kind of get a sense of that?
I mean, and I'm biased because I know this stuff too, and I like the metaphor that you use, or at least the imagery of the circle. That's helpful.
Right. So gender has to do with, your personal identity. Sexual orientation, just to kind of give the difference, is about who you would like to have sex with and who you're attracted to. even sometimes it's sex, you know, if you're asexual, it's more of an emotional attraction. But if you are for gender identity, it's who you want to be as a person, like, you know, what kind of traits you want to display or that you seem to be attracted to in yourself as a person. So there's a very distinct difference. And for gender identity, there's even within that, again, like I kind of said, because of that spectrum, there's a few different categories. So some people identify as gender non-conforming, which is, again, it's people who really don't buy into those kind of binary male or female boxes and like the freedom of being able to just kind of sit in this open space of, you know, maybe an in-betweener or, you know, a neither. So don't really want to be kind of pigeonholed to one category, which can be very freeing for people. And I just kind of want to make that clear, because I think a lot of people give gender non-conforming people like a bad rep because they're like saying they have to choose a side or something. But to be honest,
not
it could
just
be
not even just choosing a side, but just the fact like, okay, there's so all these labels or whatever, but that just speaks to the society we're in. Is like, we have to even put these labels on it because you don't understand. Like, you won't open your mind for a second to understand. So I think,
right.
you know what I mean? Because I think even as someone, let's say someone who's in the community and they identify in these ways that you're talking about, they might even feel some sort of tendency to want to have to feel like they have to explain themselves by using these labels and using these terms, which then again is just reverting them back to pigeonholing them into this box, which they so beautifully don't want to be in. So
right. Right. The labels are more for other people, not for the person. And we create labels and these things because that's what we do as humans. We like to simplify things down to as simple as a name when there's so much more to a person than that. But yeah, so these labels we're talking about right now are commonly used, but of course they're just labels, and a person is a person in the end, and they're more complex than this. But another common label used in the community is gender fluid. So I wondered if you could describe that one to the people.
The people. Yeah, I mean, I feel like you're doing a good job with it, clearly saying it. The way I talk, I feel like is so touchy-feely. So bear with me here. Gender fluid means that well, first of all, it's coming from a lens where someone does not have to express or explain how they're feeling, who they like, how they express it, and not only feel like they don't have to explain that, but they also don't have to show you all the time, like, oh, this is, you know, this is how I'm feeling. There's no explanation needed. So gender fluidity means, you know, one day I feel this way and this is how I present myself. The next day this is how I might feel another time. There's no like rules or, you know, like you said, box to that.
Yeah. They don't really follow like societal expectations, and they don't place those restrictions on themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
And honestly, like, if just to, you know, be a little personal here, when I wake up in the morning, I'm gonna feel, you know, so many different things depending on whether I slept well, depending on if it's a good mental health day, depending on what my stomach is hungry. And I feel like for me, my mood really, it really is this, like how I'm feeling on the inside, it really helps me determine what's going to make my day a good day. And I get to choose that. No one else gets to choose that for me, right? Like, that's all based off of my own self-care, my own self-identifiers, like if I'm hungry, if I'm not hungry, you know, I don't have to sit there and explain what I choose after that. And I know for my personal expression of, like, let's just say, for example, how I feel like I want to show up in the world that day, which this is getting into like a whole nother thing, but I'll keep it brief. I feel like so often we feel like we have to fit ourselves or shrink ourselves into these boxes that are labeled as professional or well kept or, you know, however you want to label it, that society has told us. And the way that I've been functioning more so now as if I stepped into myself and stepped into my power and who I am, sometimes my mood, I don't want to wear jeans. Like I want to wear flowy pants and I want to express myself in a very like free way.
Hmm.
Forget about like whether it's masculine and feminine or neither or both. It's I just want to express myself and I get to choose that. And so I feel like when people want to start like putting so much control around it, I really get confused because if I'm comfortable, I'm going to show up in the best way that I can, you know? I don't know if that's going too
Yeah.
much on a tangent, but
I think that's a good giving a good idea to everyone about like what maybe somebody who is gender fluid might experience, or how they live their life. So I think that's a
mm,
good. Thank you for sharing.
yeah, of course. I'm all for the function of clothes too. So like if it looks nice, but also it's, you know, I can bend over or kids, you know, because I work a lot with kids. So it to me, I need my clothes to feel comfortable. So,
Right.
anyways, that's besides the point. But
Yeah,
anyways,
but definitely. So the next term that I want to talk about, actually, before I go into transgender, which I'll get into a little more detail about, but is cisgender, because people
mm,
don't actually know what cisgender means a lot of the
mm-hmm,
time. For example, I'll give a personal example. My mom, she works in human resources, and she had something come up in her workplace where somebody was asking about using pronouns. And then I told her, like, yeah, well, they could be cisgender. And then she was like, what's that? And I'm like, well, you're cisgender. She's like, I am? What is that?
aw,
it means it means that you align with your biological
mm,
body and sex, and that your gender identity matches your biological parts, basically, that you were born with, that were associated with our societal idea of what it is to be feminine. So yeah, so cisgender is a term we use to basically describe people who are in our society the majority.
mm.
So just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah,
Just
we're being all
people don't know that
inclusive
one.
today. Love
Yeah.
it.
So transgender. Now, this one is definitely a little more specific. So it was included in that act, which is great.
Mm,
But obviously, you can see now that the act only really included like sexual orientation and gender identity, and not so specific. So this might not be able to protect a lot of people. This is where laws can get tricky, and that's why interpretations are important. But
mm,
when you identify as transgender, essentially you have a disconnection from what you identify with in regards to your identity and what you physically might have been born with uh, as a part of your sexual body. Um, so because of that disconnect that you feel in your body, it can cause a lot of discomfort, and it can cause the term that is used in what we call the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Diagnoses. It's commonly used in the mental health field and in the medical field. And basically, the term they use is called gender dysphoria, and that is definitely labeling somebody, and it's labeling transgender as a mental health illness,
mm,
which obviously a lot of people have problems with, and a lot of people want to change. Unfortunately, this the fact that we diagnose people with this, actually, because of how healthcare has been, it's actually helped a lot of the trans community get access to medical care. So it's really this kind of double-edged sword here, because it does help in some ways, and then it hurts a lot in other ways, because it continues the
mm,
stigma
mm,
around the fact that being transgender now is like a mental illness, which it's not.
mm, mhm,
Um, so we really want, but so the stigma is really important to talk about, because that then goes into kind of what I think is going on in the world now with regards to the Black Lives Matter movement, regards to trans Black Lives Matter.
mhm,
Um, so I want to kind of move in that direction, but before I do, I
yeah.
just want to know if there's anything that you wanted to add about transgender identity or anything like that. I mean, I'm giving a brief synopsis, but I feel like it's important to talk about what's happening now.
One thing I guess I want to point out, and it's just because it's close. Like I mean, I have friends of all everything, and one of my closest, dearest friends uses so these terms that we're using. If you choose to use them to explain certain things, sometimes you'll hear people talk about the term trans and non-binary interchangeably, um, which I just felt like was important to note because from my personal learning and knowledge and everything, I never knew you could interchange them. I just never, I'm learning too. So um, I didn't know if you had any thoughts about that or,
Yeah, I'm
comments.
going to say there's a lot of different terms being used in the trans community. So they are moving away from like, they used to use the term F to M, which is like female to male, or
Right.
and they're actually moving to terms that are more inclusive, like trans feminine or trans
Mm-hmm.
masculine.
Mm-hmm.
It really is just the person's own
Yeah.
preference in the end. So it's always good to just ask. You
Mm-hmm.
ask what their preferred pronouns are, you share what your preferred pronouns are without being necessarily prompted. That should
Mm-hmm.
be like with every person you speak with. I mean, it should be more, I mean, that's what the trans community for sure is trying to, and advocates are trying to move for. It's just kind of having, even in your email signature, just your preferred pronouns, just kind of
Right.
having it there just to kind of create more awareness, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
And not assume, right, and not have an expectation.
Right.
I also want to just point out that you are able to change your like on your driver's license and legally if you want to be recognized or however you want to be recognized. Um, I had a friend who was able to do that, and so that's why I do think this is so important because we're LGBTQ community is starting to be able to move in a way in this world that they never have or that we never have before. So
Right.
it's really important that these things are talked about. It's really important that people are asking questions, and even if you get it wrong the first time, keep getting it wrong until you can get it right.
Mm-hmm.
um, ask questions, be uncomfortable, sit with being uncomfortable. It's okay to be uncomfortable because guess what? In 1 minute, you're going to know something and then you're going to be like, cool, or you're going to have a different feeling. So you're not going to be uncomfortable anymore. These are feelings and they'll change. And, feelings don't always stay. So just
Yeah.
something to start putting, like you said, into the conversation, into your emails, into that flow of communication.
Right. And so, like, another, obviously the movement with the Black Lives Matter has hopefully made, I mean, hopefully in a sense, made a lot of people uncomfortable because in a way that's what we wanted, right? That's what people want, is for people to stop sitting complacently and recognize like what's happening and how uncomfortable a whole group of humans have been feeling and
Feel all the
experiencing.
time.
Right. So in that, the current, the last few days I've been hearing a lot more about the trans Black Lives Matter, and I think that's such a great movement.
Mm,
I feel like
mm-hmm,
with the stigma, so there's so much stigma in minority groups, especially around gay and trans individuals. So particularly in the African American and Black community, masculinity is really upheld. And
mm,
personally, I could speak from the Hispanic community for sure. Any straying away from masculine traits is seen as being weak and as not something that is advocated for. Um, so people in the trans community specifically face an increase in discrimination and prejudice. A lot of times, very aggressive acts that are done to them. So
mm,
specifically for the Black Trans Lives Matter, recently when they were protesting, a Black trans woman was attacked by four cisgender Black males during the protest. so, this really sparked a lot of more attention to the fact that, you can't just say one person's life is more important than another. Like, everybody's life has equal value, and some populations are not seen, and we want them to be seen and heard. So we really want to advocate for them. So I feel like this movement is so significant for the trans community, but especially the people of color in the trans community, because they are often the ones who experience the most adversity.
Mm-hmm. And so what she's referring to is sort of what I touched on a little bit in the beginning about the Trump administration erasing trans health protections recently, which is a part of you had mentioned it's part of the Affordable Care Act. Yeah, the Patient Protection of, which was a part of the Obamacare movement, right?
Yeah. So Obama advocated for trying to get everybody affordable healthcare, including the trans community. But
everybody.
Trump was not as supportive of that and has been trying to strip away some of those rights.
Right. So although we had talked about the very first thing, there was also, this announcement of releasing a rule to repeal the trans inclusive protections, which Melanie had mentioned to me about how this can really impact, or actually I read this too, how it can really impact trans people in the military and just in general with healthcare. As you can imagine, if you just kind of think about if that was repealed for yourself, how highly that would impact you, but let alone adding being in the military, having healthcare. So
yeah, well, just in general, people of minority communities generally have a harder time accessing healthcare as it is, and when they do access healthcare, they don't get treated the same way that their white counterparts might get treated with regards to accessing medical care. So if you compound, the intersectionality then of being also transgender or even gay and trying to access care, and the fact that if you're transgender, that's already been denied to you, you can't get your care for being like you can't get your care regarding your transitioning, which really would help with your mental health, because then you would feel more aligned and comfortable in your body. Then you're stuck feeling like they're in this hopeless state of not ever feeling whole within yourself, right?
Yeah.
So this movement now is really moving our country in a more inclusive direction, which is where we want to be.
Right. I'm still fighting in the same breath. Yeah. I think that's a good place to end here for today.
Yeah. I think so.
We will be back with some more topics and just conversations together. We hope that everyone is feeling okay, staying safe, and staying healthy.
Yes. Thank everybody for tuning in today.
Thank you. Bye.